The sky over Metz was gray and heavy, the kind of oppressive gray that seems to press down on the earth itself, as if the heavens were holding their breath, watching the unfolding drama below. For weeks, Allied forces had tried everything to break the German fortress. Metz, perched on the Moselle River with its centuries-old walls and modern fortifications, had been called impregnable by both German engineers and Allied strategists. It was a fortress designed to withstand siege after siege, a symbol of German military pride and discipline. Yet now, in December of 1944, the fortress was about to meet a force it could not have imagined. General George S. Patton, the American commander known for his audacity, his fury, and his uncanny ability to turn the impossible into the inevitable, Allied soldiers had approached Metz with caution for months. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Thousands of German soldiers entrenched in fortified bunkers, armed with heavy artillery, machine guns, and mines that could tear apart entire columns in an instant. The terrain around the fortress was equally unforgiving. Rolling hills, dense forests, and icy rivers made maneuvering tanks and artillery a logistical nightmare. For many commanders, Metz seemed to embody the very definition of frustration and stalemate. Weeks turned into months, and still the fortress resisted every probing attack. Morale among the Allied forces dipped as soldiers witnessed failed assaults, destroyed equipment, and mounting casualties. Metz had become a symbol of endurance for the Germans and a source of frustration for the Allies. Then came Patton. Unlike other commanders who weighed their options cautiously, Patton thrived on bold, decisive action. He was a man of contradictions, a brilliant strategist who sometimes seemed reckless, a disciplinarian who valued speed over ceremony, and a tactician who believed in the power of momentum as much as firepower. Where others saw obstacles, Patton saw opportunity. He believed that no fortress was impregnable, no matter how well built or well defended. To him, Metz was not a barrier but a challenge, a puzzle waiting to be solved with audacity and precision. Patton's approach was unlike anything the Germans had faced. Instead of waiting for reinforcements or planning months of siege operations, he acted immediately. Tanks rumbled across frozen fields, their treads grinding over ice and mud, leaving deep impressions in the earth. Artillery shells screamed through the air like banshees, tearing through stone walls and cutting through barbed wire with terrifying efficiency. Infantry units moved in perfect synchronization behind the armored columns, ready to exploit any breach the tanks created. The German defenders, despite their confidence in their fortress, were taken aback by the sheer speed and aggression of Patton's advance. Metz, the impregnable fortress, was beginning to crumble before their eyes. Inside the command posts, both Allied and German officers watched the unfolding events with a mix of awe and disbelief. Patton moved among his generals with a commanding presence, issuing orders that were precise yet flexible, allowing his subordinates the freedom to adapt as the battle evolved. He studied maps with intense concentration, his mind working faster than any pencil could trace. Every movement was calculated to maintain momentum, every strike designed to unsettle the enemy psychologically as well as physically. He did not merely attack Metz, he disrupted its very sense of invulnerability. As Patton pressed forward, the psychological impact on the German defenders became evident. Soldiers who had been trained to believe in the fortress's invincibility now questioned their superiors. Confusion and fear began to seep into the ranks. Defensive positions were abandoned as troops retreated to secondary lines, only to find themselves under relentless pressure from Patton's advancing forces. The once formidable walls of Metz, which had repelled countless attacks over the decades, now seemed fragile, almost vulnerable. Patton's strategy was working not just on a tactical level but on a psychological one. He was breaking the enemy's belief in their own strength. Meanwhile, across the English Channel in London, news of the battle reached Winston Churchill. The British Prime Minister leaned back in his leather chair, eyes fixed on the map of Europe pinned to the wall. Each report that arrived from the front lines was like a pulse, beating faster and faster as updates detailed Patton's movements. Churchill was a man accustomed to the ebb and flow of war, yet even he felt a sense of exhilaration mixed with apprehension. Metz had been a thorn in the side of the Allies for months, tying down troops that could have been deployed elsewhere. The prospect of it falling in mere days under Patton's command was both astonishing and deeply reassuring. Churchill's secretary entered the room, papers trembling slightly in his hands. "Sir, the reports, 50,000 German soldiers have surrendered. Metz is ours," he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and excitement. Churchill paused, letting the news settle. 50,000 prisoners of war, an astonishing number and a testament not only to the success of the operation, but to the brilliance of the man who had led it. A wry smile spread across Churchill's face as he leaned forward, fingers steepled. 50,000, you say, he murmured, almost to himself. Then, his voice carrying a rare note of awe, he added, "Patton." The man turns iron walls to dust, back on the battlefield. The surrender of the German soldiers unfolded with an almost surreal calm. Rows of men, weary and demoralized, laid down their weapons, the sound of their surrender echoing through the frozen air. Patton observed from a slight elevation, his expression unreadable but his mind already moving ahead, calculating the next steps. He did not linger in triumph. For him, victory was a process, a series of continuous actions that required both foresight and ruthlessness. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing his strategy executed flawlessly, in witnessing the tangible results of planning, audacity, and determination. Soldiers who had been skeptical of Patton's aggressive style now felt a surge of pride and relief. They had seen the impossible made real, the fortress that had loomed over them for months reduced to rubble and surrender. Letters home would speak of Metz not just as a victory, but as a moment of legend, a testament to the power of leadership and daring. Officers recorded the events meticulously, aware that history was being written with every shell fired and every wall breached. In London, Churchill could not help but reflect on the broader significance of the victory. Metz was not merely a fortress, it was a symbol of German resilience, a strategic linchpin that had prevented the Allies from advancing more rapidly. Its fall represented more than just a tactical success. It was a psychological blow to the enemy and a rallying point for Allied morale. Churchill's mind raced as he considered the implications: a strengthened position in Europe, a morale boost for troops across the continent, and the undeniable evidence that bold action could yield extraordinary results. He summoned his top aides and military advisors, who crowded the room, eager to hear his thoughts. Churchill spoke slowly, deliberately, as if weighing each word against the scale of history. "Patton has done the extraordinary," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "He has not merely broken a fortress, he has shattered the illusion that any German position is safe from relentless pressure. Metz stands as a warning and a lesson. In one man we see both the fury and the genius that can turn the tide of war. Patton's methods, though unconventional, had demonstrated the effectiveness of speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. He had forced the Germans to react to him, to abandon their preconceived notions of invulnerability. Every maneuver, every calculated risk, had contributed to the rapid collapse of a fortress that had been considered unassailable. Churchill recognized the genius behind the tactics, understanding that such brilliance could not be measured merely in maps and numbers. It was something far more profound, something that inspired both awe and hope. On the ground, the atmosphere around Metz remained tense even after the surrender. Soldiers moved among the ruins, checking for hidden pockets of resistance, securing captured weapons and assisting the prisoners. The destruction was extensive. Shattered walls, twisted metal, and scorched earth bore testimony to the ferocity of Patton's assault. Yet amidst the chaos, there was a sense of order, a reflection of the discipline and planning that had guided every step of the operation. Patton himself walked the perimeter, observing the results with an analytical eye. He spoke sparingly, issuing concise commands to ensure that the victory would not be squandered by oversight or complacency. He understood the fragility of success in war, the need to consolidate gains even while preparing for the next phase of operations. His mind was already moving ahead, anticipating the challenges that would follow, knowing that Metz was but one step in a much larger campaign to defeat Germany. Churchill, meanwhile, allowed himself a moment of private reflection. He raised a glass of port in thought, imagining the scene unfolding across the Channel. Metz, once a symbol of German pride, had fallen. 50,000 prisoners, walls torn asunder, and a demonstration of audacity and brilliance that would be remembered for generations. "History will remember Metz," he murmured, "not for the walls, not for the guns, but for the man who crushed them as if they were nothing." The significance of the victory extended beyond immediate military gains. Allied troops across Europe felt a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. The notion that the German war machine was invincible had been challenged, if not entirely dispelled. Soldiers wrote home of Patton's leadership, recounting tales of daring maneuvers and relentless attacks that defied conventional wisdom. In the minds of many, Metz became synonymous with audacity, courage, and the triumph of strategy over assumption. As the day ended, the frozen sun setting over the Moselle River cast long shadows across the battlefield. Metz lay quiet now, a fortress reduced to history by the sheer force of will and intellect. Patton, always looking forward, already contemplated the next objectives, while Churchill, across the Channel, savored the rare combination of relief and admiration. The fortress SS had fallen, but the story of its fall, the brilliance, the courage, and the relentless pursuit of victory would resonate far beyond the cold winter air of December 1944. 50,000 prisoners, the rubble of Metz, and the indelible mark of one man's genius were enough to change the perception of the war. Where despair had once lingered, hope now surged. Where stalemate had seemed inevitable, action had rewritten the possibilities. And in the quiet corridors of power, Churchill's whispered words captured the essence of the moment. "Patton, the man turns iron walls to dust." It was a simple observation, yet it carried with it the weight of history, a recognition that audacity, strategy, and determination could achieve what others deemed impossible. The morning after Patton's relentless advance on Metz dawned with a strange stillness, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The once imposing fortress, renowned as unassailable, now lay scarred and battered, its walls riddled with the unmistakable marks of relentless artillery fire. Among the Allied troops, the atmosphere was electric with a mix of disbelief, relief, and cautious anticipation. Men trudged across the icy ground, mud caking their boots, rifles slung over tired shoulders, yet their eyes sparkled with the quiet exhilaration of witnessing what they had thought impossible. The Impregnable had fallen. The German soldiers who had once manned Metz's formidable defenses were a study in confusion and despair. Those who had survived Patton's initial assault now found themselves facing the overwhelming reality of surrender. Rows of men, some frozen in place from shock, others moving methodically under officer direction, laid down their weapons in the cold winter morning. Machine guns were stacked neatly beside battered bunkers, artillery pieces silenced and abandoned. The surrender was massive, 50,000 soldiers, a staggering number that reflected not only Patton's tactical brilliance, but the cumulative psychological toll his assault had inflicted. Inside the shattered fortifications, German officers attempted to maintain order. Shouts rang across courtyards as commanders tried to rally their men, but discipline was fragile. Many soldiers, exhausted, demoralized, and hungry, simply could not muster the will to resist further. They had watched their defensive positions obliterated in mere days, walls crumbling under shell fire, bunkers reduced to rubble, and entire flanks outmaneuvered by Patton's rapid and audacious strategies. To them, the fortress that had been their pride, their anchor, had become a symbol of defeat. Patton himself moved through the battlefield with a singular focus, his presence commanding yet strangely calm. He observed the German surrender without pomp or theatrics, understanding that true victory was not measured in celebration, but in the efficiency of consolidation. Officers and aides hovered nearby, eager to relay reports or request guidance, but Patton's attention was already scanning the terrain, noting potential threats, and planning the next advance. Every movement of the enemy, every hesitating step of the surrendering troops was logged in his mind, analyzed for both immediate tactical decisions and lessons for future operations. The operation's success was not solely the result of brute force, it was the meticulous orchestration of speed, firepower, and psychological pressure. Patton had deployed tanks in ways that German engineers had deemed impossible, maneuvering armored divisions through terrain that was considered impassable in the freezing winter. Artillery units had fired from unexpected angles, demolishing strong points and disrupting command centers. Infantry had moved in precise coordination, exploiting every breach and exploiting the chaos that Patton's unpredictability created. The fortress, designed to withstand conventional sieges, had been overwhelmed by a combination of audacity, calculation, and relentless momentum. As the surrender continued, the prisoners were gathered and accounted for with military precision. Officers oversaw the collection of weapons and supplies, ensuring that no stragglers remained to regroup or resist. The sheer number of prisoners posed a logistical challenge. 50,000 men required processing, security, and transportation. Yet Patton's staff operated with efficiency, the chaos of battle giving way to an organized system that reflected the discipline and foresight of their commander. Soldiers, both American and German, moved with a sense of purpose, their exhaustion tempered by the clarity of their roles in the aftermath of conquest. The human dimension of the surrender was striking. Among the German soldiers were young men barely out of adolescence, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. They had been indoctrinated to believe in the invincibility of their defenses, yet the reality they now faced was starkly different. Some wept quietly, others stared numbly at the ruins around them. Patton understood the psychological impact of victory as well as its tactical implications. The surrender was not merely a removal of enemy forces, it was a demonstration that audacity, courage, and calculated risk could break not only walls, but the very will of those who manned them. Meanwhile, news of Metz's fall traveled rapidly through Allied command channels. Across the Channel in London, Churchill received updates with increasing fascination. He pored over maps, tracking the movement of troops, the collapse of German positions, and the steady procession of prisoners. Churchill had long admired Patton's brilliance, but the speed and scale of this victory exceeded even his expectations. He recognized the significance of the event. Metz was not just a tactical victory, it was a strategic triumph with profound implications for the broader campaign in Europe. The surrender of 50,000 soldiers meant not only a reduction of enemy manpower, but a psychological blow to German morale that would echo through the ranks in the weeks and months to come. Churchill convened a private briefing with his top military advisors, the room filled with aides anxious to hear his assessment. The Prime Minister's eyes gleamed with a mixture of admiration and contemplation as he spoke. "Patton has demonstrated what I have long suspected," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "It is not merely strength that wins battles, but the ability to combine audacity with precision, foresight with action. Metz stands as a testament to that principle. 50,000 prisoners, men who believed in their own invincibility, now surrender. That is not just victory, that is proof of genius in action. On the ground, Patton's forces moved swiftly to secure the surrounding areas. He understood that conquest was only the first step. Consolidation was equally important. Patrols scoured the ruins for hidden pockets of resistance, engineers cleared paths through rubble, and supply units distributed food, medical aid, and ammunition to both Allied troops and surrendered soldiers. The winter cold added urgency to these efforts, as exposure could prove as deadly as any remaining enemy. Patton's attention to detail ensured that the victory at Metz would not be undermined by logistical oversights or disorder in the aftermath. The surrendering German officers were brought forward to negotiate terms and provide intelligence. Patton interrogated them with a methodical calm, extracting information about troop movements, fortifications, and supply lines. He was meticulous, knowing that each piece of information could inform the next phase of operations. At the same time, he treated the prisoners with a disciplined fairness, recognizing the importance of maintaining order and avoiding unnecessary reprisals. His conduct reinforced the image of a commander who was both ruthless in strategy and controlled in execution, a man whose authority derived from competence rather than cruelty. The morale among Patton's troops soared. Men who had witnessed the destruction of Metz and the surrender of tens of thousands of enemy soldiers felt a renewed sense of purpose. Letters written home recounted tales of courage, ingenuity, and the relentless advance of forces, led by a commander whose reputation was rapidly solidifying into legend. Soldiers spoke of Patton's presence on the battlefield, his unwavering determination, and the clarity of his command. For many, Metz was more than a fortress. It was a proving ground, a demonstration of what disciplined, audacious leadership could achieve. Yet amidst the celebration, Patton remained vigilant. He knew that the Germans would regroup elsewhere, that Metz was but one node in a network of defenses that still threatened Allied progress. His mind constantly calculated, projecting movements, anticipating resistance, and planning the next series of strikes. Victory, in Patton's view, was not a moment to linger upon, but a foundation upon which further success could be built. Every decision he made was measured against the broader objective, the ultimate defeat of the German war machine and the liberation of Europe. Back in London, Churchill followed the reports with keen interest. He recognized that Metz represented a turning point not only in military terms, but in the perception of Allied strength. Where once the enemy seemed invincible, now the narrative had shifted. The fortress that had held for decades had fallen in days, and the psychological impact on both sides of the conflict was profound. Churchill's admiration for Patton deepened as he considered the strategic implications, a demonstration of audacity and initiative that could inspire troops, undermine enemy morale, and accelerate the overall campaign. The surrender also revealed the human cost of war. German soldiers, many conscripted and barely trained, faced an uncertain future as prisoners of war. Allied medical teams tended to the wounded, providing care under challenging conditions. Engineers and logistics personnel worked tirelessly to stabilize the battlefield, clear mines, and secure VITA positions. The enormity of managing 50,000 prisoners in the midst of winter, while maintaining operational momentum, underscored the complexity of modern warfare. Yet through it all, Patton's leadership ensured that order was maintained, discipline enforced, and the victory at Metz preserved as both a tactical and symbolic triumph. Patton himself, ever forward-looking, began planning subsequent operations. He studied maps, consulted with aides, and considered intelligence reports, already envisioning the next obstacles and the means by which they could be overcome. Metz was not an endpoint but a springboard. The success at the fortress demonstrated the effectiveness of bold, decisive action and set a precedent for how future operations could be conducted. Every maneuver, every calculated risk, every demonstration of force became part of a larger strategic framework designed to keep the enemy off balance and maintain the momentum of the Allied advance. As evening fell over the battlefield, the scale of the surrender became fully apparent. Camps of prisoners were established, supply lines secured, and the remnants of Metz's defenses examined for intelligence. The soldiers of the Allied forces moved with purpose, their exhaustion tempered by the satisfaction of a mission executed with extraordinary efficiency. The fortress that had once seemed impenetrable now lay in ruins, a testament to the audacity, precision, and relentless drive of Patton's command. Across the Channel, Churchill allowed himself a rare moment of private reflection. He raised a glass in thought, considering the magnitude of what had occurred. Metz had fallen, 50,000 enemy soldiers had surrendered, and the course of the war had shifted in a single audacious campaign. He understood that history would remember not just the conquest of a fortress, but the brilliance of the man who had made it possible. Patton, he whispered to himself, has shown us that audacity and precision can triumph where logic and caution fail. Metz is not merely a victory, it is a declaration that no fortress, no matter how formidable, is beyond the reach of determined will. The story of Metz, its destruction, and the surrender of its defenders spread quickly through Allied lines. Soldiers spoke of the audacity and brilliance they had witnessed, sharing tales of strategy, courage, and relentless pressure that defied conventional expectations. Civilians across liberated territories would soon hear of the fortress's fall, understanding that the Allied advance was unstoppable, that even the most fortified positions could not resist a combination of ingenuity, discipline, and sheer determination. Patton's victory at Metz had reshaped not only the battlefield, but the perception of warfare itself. It demonstrated that speed, audacity, and psychological insight could be as decisive as firepower and numbers. It reinforced the notion that leadership, vision, and calculated risk were as vital to success as the most sophisticated weapons or the most elaborate fortifications. And it left an indelible mark on both soldiers and commanders alike, a vivid lesson in what could be achieved when intellect, courage, and relentless action converged in the theater of war. The aftermath of Metz was monumental, both in tangible military terms and in its psychological resonance across Europe. The once feared fortress, celebrated for centuries as a symbol of German engineering prowess and defensive might, had fallen completely under Patton's relentless assault. The rubble of stone walls, scorched earth, and twisted metal bore witness to the scale and ferocity of the offensive, while the sight of 50,000 surrendered German soldiers underscored the sheer magnitude of the victory. Yet the victory was far from static. It was a living, breathing event that rippled outward, reshaping the landscape of war in profound and immediate ways. On the ground, Allied soldiers moved through the ruins of Metz with a mix of exhaustion, awe, and professional vigilance. The battlefield, still smoldering in places from artillery bombardments, required constant attention. Engineers and sappers worked tirelessly to clear mines and unexploded shells, ensuring that the advancing troops could consolidate their hold without further casualties. Supply officers coordinated food, medical aid, and reinforcements, navigating frozen roads choked with wreckage and debris. Amid the chaos of destruction and the demands of logistics, Patton's leadership remained the keystone, the singular presence ensuring that order and discipline were maintained amidst a whirlwind of operational complexity. Patton himself moved with a purpose that never wavered. He inspected positions, assessed the condition of units, and made rapid decisions about the distribution of forces to secure Metz and its surroundings. His attention to detail was extraordinary. No detail was too minor, no report too trivial. Every captured gun, every abandoned vehicle, and every surrendered soldier was logged and accounted for. Patton knew that the victory, impressive as it was, could be squandered by inattention or mismanagement. Metz, though conquered, was a springboard for further advances into German-held territory, and he intended to exploit the momentum fully. The surrendering German soldiers were a study in contrasts. Some moved with mechanical compliance, accepting their fate without resistance, while others lingered in stunned disbelief, unable to process the speed and ferocity of Patton's campaign. Officers, realizing the futility of further resistance, negotiated their positions and provided intelligence on German movements, fortifications, and supply lines. Patton treated them methodically, with a combination of discipline and pragmatism. His approach was clinical rather than vindictive. He understood that in order to maintain order and prevent chaos, the prisoners had to be managed efficiently, without unnecessary cruelty, but with unmistakable authority. Soldiers from both sides bore witness to the transformative power of momentum in war. Allied troops, who had once approached Metz with caution and trepidation, now experienced the exhilaration of seeing what audacity and decisiveness could achieve. Letters sent home from the front lines described the fall of Metz in almost mythic terms. Tanks charging through frozen terrain thought impassable. Artillery destroying fortified bunkers with precision. Infantry exploiting breaches with uncanny coordination. Soldiers spoke of Patton's presence on the battlefield as both terrifying and inspiring. His energy seemed inexhaustible, his vision unparalleled, and his audacity relentless. In London, Churchill monitored the reports with mounting fascination. Each dispatch from Metz added depth to his understanding of Patton's methods and the scale of the achievement. He saw not merely the conquest of a fortress, but the demonstration of strategic brilliance and psychological warfare. Metz had been considered a linchpin in the German defensive network, a place where many Allied officers had feared to tread. Its rapid fall, and the surrender of 50,000 enemy soldiers, was a revelation. Speed, audacity, and initiative could yield results that traditional calculations had deemed impossible. Churchill's admiration for Patton deepened with every report, yet he also recognized the strategic implications: a demoralized enemy, a strengthened Allied position, and the potential to accelerate the liberation of occupied territories. The psychological impact of Metz extended far beyond the battlefield. Across Europe, German commanders were forced to confront the fragility of their assumptions. The fortress that had been described as impregnable was now a stark symbol of vulnerability, a humbling lesson in the consequences of underestimating the audacity of Allied commanders. Soldiers who had once believed in the invincibility of their positions now faced a bitter reality. No fortification, no matter how formidable, could withstand a relentless, intelligent, and daring assault. The morale of the German forces, already strained by months of attritional warfare, suffered a significant blow. Metz became a cautionary tale, a lesson in both the perils of overconfidence and the power of decisive leadership. Patton's success at Metz was also a demonstration of the interplay between physical and psychological warfare. By moving quickly, striking unexpectedly, and exploiting weaknesses with precision, he forced the enemy into a reactive posture. The German soldiers, conditioned to believe in the permanence of their fortifications, were destabilized by a commander who refused to play by conventional rules. Patton's ability to combine mobility, firepower, and unpredictability created an environment where surrender became inevitable. He had not simply won a battle, he had reshaped the enemy's perception of what was possible, undermining confidence and morale simultaneously with the physical destruction of Metz. On the Allied side, the soldiers absorbed the lessons of Metz as a blueprint for future operations. They witnessed firsthand how momentum, coordination, and audacity could amplify combat effectiveness. Infantry and armored units, artillery and engineers, all operated in harmony under Patton's leadership, creating a force multiplier that magnified the impact of each action. Officers took notes, debriefed units, and analyzed every decision, understanding that Metz offered insights into the evolving nature of modern warfare, insights that could be applied in subsequent campaigns as the Allies pressed deeper into German territory. The logistical challenges of managing 50,000 prisoners were immense. Temporary camps had to be established, security maintained, and supplies allocated. Medical teams treated the wounded, while officers coordinated the movement of prisoners to secure locations. Patton supervised these operations with the same meticulous care he applied to combat strategy. The efficient handling of prisoners ensured that the victory at Metz was not undermined by disorder or inefficiency. It was a testament to the idea that leadership extended beyond the battlefield, encompassing administration, logistics, and human management. Churchill, following the events closely, understood the broader significance of Metz. It was more than a single victory, it was a paradigm shift. The fall of such a fortress signaled to the German High Command that Allied ingenuity, audacity, and operational flexibility could overcome the most daunting defensive structures. It also signaled to the Allied nations that victory was not only achievable, but accelerating. Churchill reflected on the psychological dimensions of the battle, the morale boost for Allied troops, the demoralization of German forces, and the inspiration such a bold maneuver would provide to the free world. Metz was a message, and Patton had delivered it with extraordinary clarity. The human dimension of the aftermath was profound. Soldiers on both sides confronted the realities of war in stark terms: loss, exhaustion, fear, and survival. Allied troops assisted prisoners, distributed food, and stabilized positions. Engineers reconstructed damaged infrastructure to facilitate further operations. Medics worked tirelessly in freezing conditions to tend to the wounded. Patton's presence and leadership imbued these efforts with coherence and purpose. The battlefield, though chaotic, was organized into a functional system capable of supporting continued military objectives. Patton, ever forward-looking, did not dwell on the victory at Metz. He began planning subsequent operations almost immediately, analyzing terrain, enemy dispositions, and supply lines. The momentum gained from the fall of Metz was to be leveraged into future advances, ensuring that the Germans would have little opportunity to regroup or fortify secondary positions. His strategic vision extended beyond individual battles. He perceived Metz as a crucial node in a broader campaign to destabilize German defenses, liberate occupied territories, and accelerate the eventual defeat of the Nazi regime. Churchill's reflections in London were filled with admiration and anticipation. He understood that the fall of Metz was not an isolated success, but part of a pattern of Allied initiative that could redefine the trajectory of the European war. In private moments, he allowed himself a rare sense of satisfaction, raising a glass in acknowledgement of Patton's audacity and brilliance. Patton, he whispered, has not merely won a battle, he has demonstrated what leadership, courage, and vision can achieve. Metz will be remembered not for its walls, but for the man who shattered them. The story of Metz spread rapidly, reaching soldiers, civilians, and policymakers alike. Tales of the fortress's destruction, the surrender of 50,000 soldiers, and the audacity of Patton's maneuvers circulated widely. Soldiers drew inspiration from the operation, civilians were reassured by the efficacy of the Allied advance, and enemy forces were forced to reevaluate their assumptions. Metz became emblematic of a broader truth: no position, no matter how fortified, could withstand a combination of strategy, audacity, and relentless execution. In the following days, Patton's forces consolidated control over Metz and its surrounding regions. Supply lines were secured, defensive positions established, and intelligence gathered from captured German officers. The fortress's fall provided a strategic advantage, offering both a base for future operations and a psychological edge in the broader campaign. Patton's meticulous attention to detail ensured that the victory would have lasting effects, rather than being a fleeting moment of triumph. The lessons of Metz extended beyond military strategy to encompass leadership and human psychology. Patton demonstrated that the combination of decisiveness, foresight, and audacity could achieve results that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. He showed that momentum, when harnessed effectively, could magnify the impact of limited forces and break even the most formidable defenses. And he proved that understanding the psychology of both one's own troops and the enemy could be as decisive as any artillery barrage or tank assault. As winter settled over the ruins, the significance of Metz became ever clearer. It was not merely a fortress that had fallen, it was a symbol of the power of initiative and the impact of leadership on the course of war. Patton's victory resonated far beyond the Moselle River, influencing strategic planning, boosting Allied morale, and shaking the confidence of the enemy. It demonstrated that even in the darkest and most daunting circumstances, audacity, intelligence, and relentless action could prevail. And in the quiet corridors of London, Churchill allowed himself a moment of private reflection, raising a glass to the man who had turned an impregnable fortress into a testament of human ingenuity and courage. Metz would not be forgotten. It was more than a battle, it was a declaration that no wall, no matter how solid, could withstand the force of vision, daring, and determination. Patton had not simply won Metz, he had reshaped the very way the war was fought, leaving a legacy that would echo long after the smoke cleared. A legacy of audacity, brilliance, and unstoppable momentum. The world would remember Metz, not for the walls, not for the guns, but for the man who had made them fall, and for the unstoppable force of will that had turned an impregnable fortress into history.